December 1887. Dakota Territory. The wind cut across the treeless prairie like a blade, carrying snow that stung exposed skin within seconds. Against a low hillside 3 miles west of what would later become the town of Edgeley, a solitary figure swung a pickaxe in a frozen earth while his breath formed clouds in the bitter air. Neighboring homesteaders paused their own winter preparations to watch. Some shook their heads. Others laughed outright. One experienced carpenter from Michigan called across the distance, "You planning to bury your family before winter does it for you?" The man, Gunnar Vikland, a Norwegian immigrant who'd arrived just 8 months earlier, didn't stop digging. He was excavating directly into the hillside, creating what looked less like a home and more like a mine shaft or a grave. His wife, Astrid, stood nearby, their 2 children huddled against her skirts, watching their father disappear into the earth. What Gunnar understood about thermal mass, earth insulation, and stable ground temperature would soon make the difference between survival and death. But first, he'd have to endure an entire season of ridicule. What did this Norwegian farmer grasp about underground shelter engineering that experienced American frontiersmen completely dismissed? The answer would reveal itself when temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero, and only one family on that stretch of prairie remained warm enough to sleep through the night. If you want to discover how ancient earth-sheltered building techniques outperformed conventional frontier construction, hit that subscribe button right now. In return, I promise you'll learn practical survival engineering that could work today, methods our ancestors perfected through necessity, not theory. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one, and your location might inspire the next story. Now, let's dig into what happened when innovation met desperation on the frozen Dakota plains. Gunnar Vikland had purchased his 160-acre homestead claim in April 1887, when the prairie still held some green and the wind felt almost gentle. He'd paid $12 for the filing fee and promised the land office he'd build a dwelling and cultivate the soil within 5 years. Standard terms. What wasn't standard was his plan for that dwelling. While other settlers immediately began felling what few cottonwood trees lined the distant creek, hauling logs for conventional cabin walls, Gunnar walked his property with a different eye. He studied the southern face of a gradual hillside where winter snow seemed to melt first. He dug test holes at various depths, noting how the soil transitioned from sandy loam to dense clay, then to a layer of compressed glacial till. At 18 inches down, even in late summer, the earth felt noticeably cooler against his palm. At 3 feet, it was cold enough to preserve butter. At 6 feet, the depth where he finally struck bedrock, the temperature remained constant regardless of the scorching August sun overhead. His neighbors noticed these strange excavations. Harold Brenner, who'd survived 3 Dakota winters in a proper 12 by 14-foot log cabin, rode over one afternoon to investigate. "You prospect for gold, Vikland?" Brenner asked, eyeing the test pits. "For something more valuable," Gunnar replied in his heavily accented English. "Stable temperature." Brenner frowned. "You mean a root cellar? A home?" The confusion on Brenner's face shifted to concern. "You're planning to live underground? Like some kind of animal?" Gunnar straightened, wiping soil from his hands. "In Norway, we build into hillsides in the North Country. Stone and earth. My uncle's gam stayed warm all winter with half the firewood of wooden houses." "This ain't Norway," Brenner said flatly. "This is Dakota territory. We build proper cabins here. For walls, a roof, a good stove. That's how civilized people live." But Gunnar had done his calculations. The limited timber available would require hauling from 6 miles away. A conventional cabin of adequate size would need roughly 80 logs, each requiring cutting, hauling, notching, and chinking. The gaps between logs would leak heat unless perfectly sealed, nearly impossible in the harsh prairie wind. And even well-built log cabins he'd seen in town required constant feeding of their stoves, burning through cords of precious firewood that settlers could barely gather fast enough. His tunnel home would need no logs. The hillside itself would provide 3 walls. The Earth's stable temperature, around 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit at depth, even in the deepest winter, would mean his heating needs would be minimal. Instead of fighting to keep minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit air out, he'd only need to raise the interior from 45 degrees Fahrenheit to a comfortable 65 degrees Fahrenheit. The differential was everything. By late September, when the first frost warnings came, Gunnar had excavated a chamber 16 feet deep into the hillside, 12 feet wide, and 20 feet long. The entrance tunnel angled downward at a gentle slope, running 8 feet before reaching the main living space. He'd reinforced the ceiling with salvaged railroad ties, purchased cheap from a crew that had overestimated their needs, laid perpendicular and covered with 2 feet of compacted earth and sod. The design seemed insane to everyone who saw it. "That roof will collapse first heavy snow," predicted Martin Kessler, an experienced builder who'd constructed half the buildings in Edgeley. "Railroad ties aren't meant to hold earth. You need proper rafters, proper pitch." "He'll suffocate," added Brenner. "No windows, no air. That family will be breathing their own poison by Christmas." Gunnar had considered ventilation carefully. He'd installed 2 4-inch iron pipes that ran from the living chamber up through the hillside to the surface. One near the front for air intake, positioned lower, and one at the rear ceiling for exhaust, positioned higher to create natural convective flow. The temperature differential between the warm interior air and cold exterior would drive circulation without any mechanical assistance. But when he tried to explain this to his critics, they dismissed it as foreign nonsense. "You think a couple of stovepipes are going to keep air fresh for 4 people?" Kessler laughed. "Vikland, you're going to kill your family trying to save a few dollars on lumber." Astrid Vikland said nothing during these confrontations, but Gunnar saw the worry in her eyes each night. Their children, 6-year-old Ingrid and 4-year-old Henrik, were too young to understand why their new home looked like a hole in the ground while their neighbors lived in proper houses with windows and front porches. By mid-October, with the structure complete, word had spread throughout the district. Families came from miles away to see the crazy Norwegians' tunnel. Some brought genuine concern. Most brought mockery. The township supervisor, a former Union Army captain named Cyrus Whitmore, arrived with a county health inspector to evaluate whether the dwelling met minimum habitability standards. "Mr. Vikland," Whitmore began, standing at the entrance and peering into the dark tunnel. "I've seen field fortifications and winter dugouts during the war. They were temporary shelters for desperate men. They were not homes for families. This," he gestured at the earthen entrance, "this is not fit for habitation." "It is reinforced," Gunnar insisted. "Railroad ties every 16 inches. Clay soil compressed. Very stable. It's a death trap," the inspector said bluntly. "What happens when you light a stove in there? Carbon monoxide will pool. Your family will be asphyxiated in their sleep." Gunnar showed them the ventilation pipes. He explained the convection principle. He demonstrated how the intake drew fresh air when he lit a candle near it. The flame bent inward, pulled by the draft. The inspector remained unmoved. "I'm recommending this claim be voided until proper housing is established. You have until spring to build a real cabin, or you'll lose your homestead rights." It was a harsh ultimatum, but not entirely unexpected. Gunnar had one card left to play, winter itself. He asked for a probationary period, allow his family to spend 1 month in the shelter. If any health issues arose, he'd concede and build conventionally come spring. Whitmore considered this. The request was unusual, but the Norwegians seemed determined, and forcing a family out of shelter, however strange, before winter seemed harsh even by frontier standards. 1 month, Whitmore agreed. "We'll check on you after Thanksgiving. If there's any sign of illness, any problems, you're out." Gunnar shook his hand. "You will see. Earth is best insulation God made." As Whitmore and the inspector rode away, Gunnar heard Brenner's voice carry across the prairie. "Give him 2 weeks before they're begging for help. Nobody lives in the ground like that. It ain't natural." Inside the tunnel home, the reality was far different from the nightmare neighbors imagined. The main chamber, once Gunnar had finished the interior work, felt surprisingly spacious. The railroad tie ceiling stood 7 feet high at the center, tall enough that Gunnar, at 5'10", could stand fully upright. The walls, carved directly from the dense clay and glacial till, had been smoothed with a trowel and sealed with a thin coating of lime plaster mixed with prairie grass fibers for binding. This wasn't mere aesthetic choice. The plaster served three purposes. It prevented soil from continuously sloughing off and dirtying living spaces. It added a modest reflective quality that made candlelight more effective. And most importantly, it created an impermeable barrier against moisture infiltration. Clay soil, while stable, could weep humidity when temperature differentials were extreme. The lime plaster stopped that cold. Gunnar had divided the space into functional zones. The front third, nearest the entrance, served as a kitchen and gathering area. Here he'd built a small masonry stove, not the massive Russian-style contraption some immigrants favored, but a compact design he'd learned from a Swedish neighbor back in Norway. The firebox was small, barely 18 inches square, but the chimney ran up through the hillside in a serpentine path, rather than straight up. This was the detail that most baffled visiting critics. Why zigzag a chimney? Kessler had demanded when he saw the design sketched out. You're creating backdraft, slowing the draw. Chimneys should run straight for maximum efficiency. But Gunnar understood something about heat transfer that most frontier builders overlooked. A straight chimney exhausts heat quickly. All that precious thermal energy rushes up and out, wasted. A serpentine path, where the flue angled back and forth through the earthen mass above the living space, allowed the stone and clay surrounding the chimney to absorb radiant heat. That heat would then conduct slowly into the chamber below and the hillside above, creating a secondary warming effect long after the fire had died down. The chimney path ran 12 feet through the earth before finally emerging at the surface. By Gunnar's calculations, approximately 40% of the stove's heat was being captured by this thermal mass rather than lost to the atmosphere. In a conventional cabin, that percentage was closer to 10%. The middle third of the chamber served as sleeping quarters. Gunnar had built two simple bed platforms from rough-cut lumber, one for him and Astrid, one for the children. Beneath these platforms, he'd excavated shallow pits and filled them with fist-sized river stones. The idea seemed bizarre to Astrid at first. "Why rocks under our beds?" she'd asked in Norwegian, the language they still used at home. "Heat storage," Gunnar explained. "When the stove runs during evening, warm air will circulate under the platforms. The stones will absorb that heat and release it slowly through the night. We won't need to keep the fire burning." It was a principle he'd learned from his uncle's Gam in Finnmark, where winters stretched dark and brutal for months. The old-timers there had perfected thermal mass heating over centuries. They knew that stone, once heated, released its warmth with miserly slowness. A single evening fire could keep a well-designed earth shelter comfortable until morning. The rear third of the chamber served as storage and a small work area. Shelves carved directly into the clay walls held preserves, dried goods, and tools. The constant cool temperature here, never rising above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the living area reached 65 degrees Fahrenheit, made it ideal for food preservation. But the most ingenious feature was one that remained invisible: the entrance design. Most critics assumed the tunnel entrance was simply a sloped passage connecting the chamber to the outside. They missed the crucial detail. Gunnar had created a double door system with a small vestibule between, an airlock, essentially. The outer door, built from thick pine planks and faced with canvas stretched tight to block wind, opened into a tiny chamber just large enough for one person to stand. 3 feet beyond that, a second door, lighter but well sealed, led into the main living space. This vestibule served as a thermal buffer. When someone entered from outside, the frigid air they brought with them was trapped in that small space. By the time they passed through the inner door, the cold had largely dissipated, warmed by contact with the earth walls around them. Heat loss from the main chamber was minimal. Additionally, Gunnar had positioned the entire entrance on the southeast face of the hillside, the direction that received maximum winter sun. Even weak December sunlight would warm the outer door area, reducing the temperature differential and making entries and exits less shocking to the system. The ventilation pipes, which had drawn so much criticism, were positioned with equal precision. The intake pipe opened at ground level about 15 feet from the entrance, in an area where snow was unlikely to accumulate deeply. Its opening was covered with a fine wire mesh to prevent rodent entry and angled downward so rain and snowmelt wouldn't drain into it. The pipe ran horizontally for several feet before angling down into the chamber's front area near the floor. The exhaust pipe emerged from the ceiling's rear section, the warmest point in the chamber due to heat rising from the stove and living areas. It ran straight up through 8 feet of earth and emerged on the hilltop, protected by a simple wooden cap that allowed air out but kept precipitation from entering. The physics were elegant. Warm, stale air would naturally rise and exit through the rear pipe, creating slight negative pressure that would draw fresh, cold air in through the front intake. That incoming cold air would enter low, warm gradually as it moved across the floor, and by the time it reached breathing height, it had mixed with the warmer room air. No drafts, no cold spots, just steady, gentle circulation. By late October, the family had moved in their modest possessions: a small wooden table, 4 chairs, bedding, cooking implements, and Astrid's most treasured item, a cast-iron cookstove that Gunnar had managed to incorporate into his masonry firebox design. The stove's top surface protruded into the room, allowing for cooking while the firebox itself was surrounded by stone and earth thermal mass. The first night they slept there, temperatures outside had dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Gunnar lit a modest fire at dusk, perhaps 3 pieces of split cottonwood, burning steadily for 2 hours. By the time they extinguished it at bedtime, the chamber felt comfortably warm, almost cozy. When morning came, Henrik woke first and immediately asked, "Papa, why isn't it cold?" Gunnar checked the outdoor thermometer. He'd hung just outside the entrance, 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, by his estimate, it was still around 58 degrees Fahrenheit. The thermal mass had worked exactly as planned, releasing its stored heat throughout the night. Astrid, who'd endured the previous winter in a drafty rented room in Edgeley, could hardly believe it. "I can see my breath outside," she said, peering through the cracked outer door. "But in here, I'm comfortable in a single shawl." "That's the earth," Gunnar said quietly. 50 degrees, always. We just add a little to make it perfect." But comfort wasn't enough to convince the skeptics. They needed proof of survival under real crisis conditions. And crisis was coming. The National Weather Bureau station in Bismarck had been tracking a massive cold front moving south from Canada. By early November, forecasters were predicting the coldest winter in recorded Dakota history. Temperatures could reach minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. Exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Livestock would die, and anyone whose shelter couldn't maintain adequate warmth would face life-threatening danger. Gunnar heard these warnings at the general store in Edgeley. He also heard the renewed mockery. "That Norwegian fool still in his hole?" someone asked the storekeeper. "Far as I know," came the reply. "Give it till Christmas. He'll come crawling out begging for real shelter." Gunnar bought his supplies, lamp oil, flour, salt pork, and said nothing. But riding home across the frozen prairie, he felt a cold knot of doubt. He'd done the calculations. He'd followed principles proven over centuries in Scandinavia. He'd built carefully, thoughtfully. But had he built well enough? Would ancient wisdom really triumph when the thermometer plunged into territory that killed without mercy? Before we find out, do me a favor. Hit that like button if you're finding this story fascinating, and make sure you're subscribed. The crisis is about to arrive, and what happens next will prove or destroy everything Gunnar believed. Comment below. Have you ever had to defend an idea everyone thought was crazy? I read every response. By mid-November, the temperature had settled into a stable cold. Daytime highs around 10 degrees Fahrenheit, nights dipping to minus 5 degrees Fahrenheit or so. Harsh, certainly, but manageable. Neighboring homesteaders burned through firewood at steady rates, their stoves roaring from dawn to dusk. Gunnar's tunnel home, by contrast, required only a small fire in the evening, burning for 2 to 3 hours, consuming perhaps 1/8 the wood his neighbors used daily. Word of this efficiency should have impressed. Instead, it fueled suspicion. "It's unnatural," declared Reverend Morton Sibley, who preached at the Methodist circuit that served the district. He'd come to check on the Vicland family's spiritual welfare and left deeply troubled. God gave us trees for building and warmth, to burrow into the earth like moles. It suggests a lack of faith in divine provision. Astrid, who'd attended services faithfully since arriving, bristled at this. We use wood, she pointed out. Just less of it. Is efficiency sinful? It's the principle, Sibley insisted. Man was given dominion over nature, not told to hide beneath it. Your children should see sunlight, breathe fresh air, live as Christians live, not as... He trailed off, unwilling to finish the comparison. Not as animals. Gunnar finished for him, his voice quiet but firm. Reverend, with respect, we are warm. My children are healthy. We burn less wood, meaning we preserve more of God's trees. I see no sin in this. Sibley left unsatisfied, and the following Sunday, his sermon reportedly touched on the importance of living according to civilized Christian standards rather than reverting to pagan earth worship. The Viclands are never mentioned by name, but the implication was clear enough that Astrid stopped attending services. The social isolation stung more than she admitted. In the Norwegian community back home, such innovation would have been discussed, debated, perhaps adopted or modified. Here, it was simply condemned as foreign strangeness, something to be mocked and avoided. The technical criticism intensified as well. Martin Kessler, the experienced builder, brought 2 colleagues to inspect the tunnel home in late November. They examined the railroad tie supports, tested the lime plaster, traced the serpentine chimney path, and studied the ventilation system. Their conclusion, delivered to the township meeting the following week, was damning. The structure is fundamentally unsound. The railroad ties are underdesigned for the lateral earth pressure they're bearing. I estimate a collapse probability of 60% by spring thaw, when moisture infiltration will weaken the bearing capacity of the surrounding soil. The ventilation is inadequate for 4 occupants. Simple volumetric calculation shows they need 3 times the air exchange rate. And the heating system, while admittedly efficient in mild cold, will fail catastrophically once temperatures reach extreme lows. The small firebox cannot possibly generate adequate BTUs to maintain survivable interior temperatures at minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit or below. Cyrus Whitmore, the township supervisor, took these findings seriously. He paid another visit to the Vicland homestead, this time with Dr. Samuel Pruitt, the circuit physician who served the area. I'm not here to condemn you, Whitmore began, standing in the main chamber and looking around with evident concern. But I need to know you understand the risk. Kessler's report suggests this shelter could fail. If we get the temperatures they're predicting, and the Weather Bureau is rarely wrong about these things, you might be in genuine danger. We have considered, Gunnar replied, but I do not believe Kessler understands earth pressure. Railroad ties are rated for bearing track and full train loads, many tons per foot. Here, they bear only 2 feet of compressed soil, perhaps 200 pounds per square foot. They will not fail. And the heating? Dr. Pruitt asked. I'm less concerned about the structure than about hypothermia. Children are especially vulnerable. If your stove can't keep this space above 50 degrees in extreme cold, we're looking at frostbite, potentially worse. Gunnar gestured to the chamber around them. The earth itself is 45 to 50 degrees. Always. We have measured. Even if my stove fails completely, we are still warmer than outside by 90 degrees. In a cabin, if stove fails, interior temperature equals exterior in 2 hours. Here, it never drops below ground temperature. That's an interesting theory, Pruitt said carefully. But theories don't keep children alive. I want to be clear, if we get reports of illness, or if your children show signs of exposure, I'm pulling them out. Township has authority to protect minors. It was a veiled threat. Lose your children to protective custody if conditions appear dangerous. Astrid's hand found Gunnar's, squeezing tight. They both understood what was at stake. After the officials left, neighbors felt emboldened to offer their own opinions. Harold Brenner, whose conventional cabin stood just a mile away, stopped by with what he framed as a generous offer. "Look, Vikland, I know you've put work into this project," he said, standing outside the entrance rather than coming in. "But it's not too late to winter with us. My cabin's tight, my stove's good, and we've got room. Bring the family over. You can prove whatever point you're trying to make come spring, but don't risk your wife and children to stubbornness." "We are not in danger," Gunnar insisted. "You don't know that," Brenner shot back. "None of us do, because nobody in their right mind tries to live like this. There's a reason cabins have windows, Gunnar. Light, air, connection to the world. You've buried your family in a tomb, and you're calling it innovation." Even the children faced ostracism. Young Ingrid, who occasionally played with the Brenner children when weather permitted, reported that the other girls had been told not to visit the dirt house anymore. Henrik, too young to fully understand, asked his mother why their home made other people angry. "It doesn't," Astrid said gently, though her voice was tight. "They're just afraid of what's different." But privately, to Gunnar, she admitted her own fears. "What if they're right?" she whispered one night as they lay in their platform bed, the chamber dark except for the faint glow from the stove's dampered firebox. "What if we're being foolish? Everything we know says people live in houses with walls and roofs and windows. Maybe there's a reason for that." Gunnar was quiet for a long moment. Then, "In Finnmark, my uncle's gam sheltered 3 generations. In Iceland, turf houses stood for centuries. In parts of China, millions live in yaodong, cave dwellings carved from lush soil. They are warm in winter, cool in summer, and they last lifetimes. This is not new, Astrid. It is only new here, where people have forgotten. But those are other places," she said. "Different climates, different people." Gunnar interrupted gently. "Maybe, or maybe just people who remember what works." He understood her fear. It was one thing to follow tradition when your entire community affirmed it, another entirely to stand alone against united skepticism. But he'd done the mathematics. He'd studied the principles. And most importantly, he'd felt the results. Steady comfort with minimal fuel, stable temperature, dry air despite the earth surrounding them. The science was sound. Soon, nature would provide the proof. On December 3rd, 1887, the first true Arctic blast arrived. Temperatures plunged overnight from 15 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind howled across the prairie at sustained speeds of 30 miles per hour, creating wind chill conditions equivalent to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit or worse. In town, the general store's thermometer, the official recording station for the district, registered minus 24 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-morning. 2 homesteaders on the northern edge of the territory reportedly froze to death in their inadequately chinked cabins when their stoves went out during the night. Every family in the district huddled close to roaring fires, burning wood at unsustainable rates just to keep interior temperatures above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Harold Brenner's cabin, despite his boasts about its tightness, dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit by dawn, even with the stove stoked all night. His family woke to ice crystals on the interior walls where their breath had condensed and frozen. And in the tunnel home, nestled beneath 2 feet of earth and sod, insulated by the planet's own stable thermal mass, the Vikland family slept comfortably. Gunnar had lit the stove at dusk, burning a slightly larger fire than usual, perhaps 5 pieces of wood over 3 hours. By bedtime, the chamber registered 64 degrees Fahrenheit on his thermometer. By morning, it had dropped to 56 degrees Fahrenheit, still warm enough that the children slept without waking, still far above the danger threshold. When Gunnar emerged to check the outdoor temperature and found minus 24 degrees Fahrenheit, he felt a wave of relief so profound it nearly buckled his knees. It had worked. Despite the mockery, despite the technical criticism, despite the predictions of catastrophic failure, it had worked. But this was only the first test. The real crisis was still coming, building strength in the frozen reaches of the Canadian Arctic, preparing to sweep south with cold that would redefine what survival meant on the Dakota Plains. And when it arrived, the difference between Gunnar's insane design and conventional wisdom would become a matter of life and death. The blizzard that struck on December 18th, 1887, would later be recorded in Weather Bureau archives as one of the most severe Arctic outbreaks in Dakota Territory history. It began with deceptive calm. A cloudless morning, temperatures around -15 degrees Fahrenheit, air so still that chimney smoke rose straight up like pillars. By noon, the wind had begun. By 2 o'clock, visibility had dropped to 0. And by nightfall, the thermometer at Edgley's General Store registered -38 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind-driven snow creating conditions the local newspaper would later describe as incompatible with mammalian survival. Gunnar had spent the morning gathering firewood from his modest stack near the entrance. He'd split extra kindling and brought it inside to dry near the stove. When the wind began its ominous rise, he knew what was coming. Weather patterns here followed predictable sequences, and this sequence spelled disaster. "We're staying inside," he told Astrid and the children. "No matter what. Even check livestock." They had 3 chickens in a small coop dug into the hillside near the main entrance. A miniature version of the tunnel home, really, with its own earth insulation. "The chickens have shelter and feed. They'll survive or they won't. We're not risking exposure." By late afternoon, the storm was in full roar. Wind shrieked across the prairie with such force that Gunnar could feel faint vibrations through the earth itself, the hillside trembling under the atmospheric assault. The outer entrance door, despite being sheltered in its recessed alcove, rattled against its frame. Snow found microscopic gaps and sifted through in fine powder that accumulated in the vestibule. Inside the main chamber, however, conditions remained almost absurdly stable. Gunnar lit the stove at 5 o'clock, using the dried kindling and building up to larger pieces of split cottonwood. The fire burned hot and fast, the serpentine chimney drawing well despite the chaotic winds outside. The earth mass surrounding the flue protected it from backdrafts and maintained steady draft pressure. By 7 o'clock, after 2 hours of burning, the chamber temperature had reached 67 degrees Fahrenheit. Gunnar dampened the stove down to a slow smolder and let the thermal mass do its work. The children, remarkably, treated the blizzard as an adventure rather than a crisis. Henrik built elaborate structures with wooden blocks on the floor, while Ingrid helped her mother prepare a simple dinner of salt pork, beans, and cornbread baked on the stovetop. The normalcy of it, children playing, family eating together, warm lamplight reflecting off lime-plastered walls, stood in surreal contrast to the lethal conditions raging above them. "Papa," Ingrid asked during dinner, "can we hear the wind?" Gunnar paused, listening. There was a sound, a distant muffled roar, like ocean waves heard from far inland. But it was so attenuated, so diminished by the earth overhead, that it seemed almost abstract. "Only a little," he said. "The ground makes a good wall, yes?" Ingrid nodded, satisfied, and returned to her meal. But Gunnar's thoughts were with his neighbors. Harold Brenner's cabin, with its log walls and shingled roof, will be taking the full brunt of that wind. Even well-chinked logs leaked air under pressure. The wind would find every microscopic gap, forcing icy drafts through the interior and stealing heat with merciless efficiency. Brenner would be burning wood as fast as he could feed it, fighting to keep his family above freezing. The Kessler household, in town, would fare slightly better with neighbors on either side providing some windbreak. But they'd still be vulnerable to the fundamental physics of convective heat loss. As warm air rose inside the cabin, cold air would infiltrate from below, creating circulation that constantly drained thermal energy. You could fight it with a roaring fire, but you couldn't win, not when the outside temperature was -38 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. Around 10 o'clock, Gunnar checked the temperature inside the chamber. 61 degrees Fahrenheit, down 6 degrees from peak, but still comfortably warm. The thermal mass, the stone-surrounded chimney, the heated earth above the living space, the warmed railroad ties and surrounding clay, was releasing its stored energy exactly as designed. The family prepared for bed. Astrid bundled the children in their sleeping clothes and tucked them into their shared platform bed. Beneath them, the river stones Gunnar had placed in the underbed pit had been warmed by the evening's heat circulation. They would continue radiating warmth upward through the wooden slats for hours. "Are we safe, Papa?" Henrik asked sleepily. "Very safe," Gunnar assured him. "The earth is protecting us. Sleep now." By midnight, when Gunnar made his final check before sleep, the interior temperature had stabilized at 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, according to later Weather Bureau records, it had reached minus 41 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill pushing the effective temperature to minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. Exposed flesh would freeze solid in under 90 seconds. The differential was staggering. 99 degrees between the lethal exterior and the comfortable interior, maintained with a single 2-hour fire and the patient thermal inertia of the Earth itself. Gunnar lay in bed next to Astrid, listening to the muffled roar of wind above. He thought about the mockery, the predictions of failure, the warnings from officials and neighbors. He thought about Kessler's report claiming the heating system would fail catastrophically in extreme cold. And then he thought about the simple, elegant truth of what was actually happening. The Earth, warmed by the planet's own core heat and insulated from the atmosphere's wild temperature swings, maintained a steady baseline. His small stove didn't have to heat from minus 41 degrees Fahrenheit to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, an impossible task. It only had to boost from 50 degrees Fahrenheit to 65 degrees Fahrenheit. 15 degrees. Child's play. Conventional cabins, by contrast, faced the full temperature differential. They had to generate 65 degrees of heat against an exterior that was 41 degrees below zero. Even with massive fuel consumption, many would fail to achieve comfortable interior conditions. Some would fail to maintain survivable conditions. The blizzard raged for 3 days. During that time, no one left their shelters. Livestock died in inadequately protected barns and pens. Firewood stocks dwindled at alarming rates. And in several cabins throughout the district, families huddled in beds under every blanket they owned, unable to keep their living spaces above 35 degrees Fahrenheit, no matter how much wood they burned. In a Vikland tunnel home, life continued almost normally. Gunnar burned his evening fires, slightly larger than usual, perhaps 4 hours instead of 2, and let the thermal mass carry them through. The temperature never dropped below 54 degrees Fahrenheit. The children played, ate regular meals, and slept soundly. Astrid baked bread and mended clothes. They were comfortable. On the third morning, the wind finally died. The temperature remained brutally cold, minus 35 degrees F at dawn, but the clear skies suggested the worst had passed. Gunnar ventured out through the entrance tunnel, pushing through snowdrifts that had accumulated in the vestibule, and emerged onto a transformed landscape. Snow had piled in massive drifts, some reaching 12 feet high where the wind had carved and deposited them. The prairie stretched, white and pristine and absolutely lifeless. No movement, no sound. Just blinding sunlight reflecting off endless snow under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. And in the distance, rising from Harold Brenner's cabin, he saw something that made his stomach clench. No smoke from the chimney. Gunnar pushed through thigh-deep snow toward Brenner's cabin, fear driving him forward despite the burning cold against his exposed face. He'd wrapped a wool scarf across his mouth and nose, but even so, each breath felt like inhaling knives. At minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, the air itself was a weapon. The cabin door was frozen shut. Gunnar pounded on it, shouting Brenner's name. After a terrifying silence, he heard movement inside, slow, sluggish. The door finally cracked open, and Harold Brenner's face appeared, pale and exhausted. "Vikland," his voice was hoarse. You made it. Are you all right? Your family." Brenner's laugh was bitter. "We're alive. Barely. Come in, if you can stand the cold." Inside the cabin, Gunnar understood immediately. Despite a stove still burning, fed with the last precious pieces of Brenner's firewood, the interior temperature was shockingly low. He could see his breath clearly. Ice had formed on the interior walls where condensation from breathing and cooking had frozen solid. The Brenner children were huddled in bed under a pile of every blanket and coat the family owned. Mrs. Brenner sat near the stove, wrapped in a quilt, her hands shaking. "We ran out of wood last night," Brenner explained, his voice flat with defeat. Burned through everything. I was chopping furniture this morning, chairs, a small table, just to keep the stove going. We couldn't let it die completely or... He didn't finish. They both knew. If the stove went out, the cabin would reach exterior temperature within 2 hours. At minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, that meant death. Gunnar noticed a thermometer hanging on the wall, 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Just 2 degrees above freezing, despite the fire burning. How much did you burn? Gunnar asked. Brenner gestured to the empty space where his woodpile had been. Everything. 3 full cords, gone in 3 days. We were feeding that stove every 20 minutes, round the clock, and still couldn't get above 40 degrees. Gunnar did quick mental math. 3 cords was roughly 384 cubic feet of stacked wood, roughly 3,000 pounds of fuel, in 72 hours. That meant Brenner had burned approximately 42 pounds of wood per hour, every hour, just to maintain near-freezing temperatures. I will bring you wood, Gunnar said, from my stack. Enough to get through until you can cut more. Brenner stared at him. You have wood to spare? We burned perhaps 1/8 of 1 cord in 3 days. I have plenty. The disbelief on Brenner's face would have been comical under different circumstances. 1/8 of a cord? How is that possible? How cold did your place get? It did not get cold, Gunnar said simply. Lowest was 54 degrees. Comfortable enough for sleeping. Brenner sank into a chair, too stunned to respond. His wife began to cry, not from distress, but from sheer relief at the promise of firewood, of survival. Over the next 2 days, as neighbors emerged from their shelters and took stock of the damage, a similar pattern revealed itself across the district. The Kessler household in town had burned through nearly 2 cords. The Peterson family in Asadi, a house built from stacked blocks of prairie sod, generally considered superior to log cabins for insulation, had managed slightly better, burning 1.5 cords, but their interior temperatures had still dropped to dangerous levels. 2 families had suffered actual casualties. The Johansons lost their youngest child, a 3-year-old boy, to what Dr. Pruitt diagnosed as hypothermia, complicated by pneumonia. The child's core temperature had dropped too low for too long in their inadequately heated cabin. And old Emil Sorensen, a bachelor who'd insisted on riding out the storm alone in a poorly constructed shack, was found frozen to death 4 days after the blizzard ended. The survival statistics were sobering. Of the 23 homesteads within a 10-mile radius of Edgeley, 18 had experienced interior temperatures below 40 degrees Fahrenheit at some point during the crisis. 11 had dropped below 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Fred suffered frostbite injuries. 2 had lost lives. And 1, the crazy Norwegian's tunnel, had remained comfortable throughout. When Cyrus Whitmore and Dr. Pruitt made their post-storm welfare check, they arrived at the Vikland homestead expecting to find a traumatized family, possibly in medical distress. Instead, they found the children playing outside in the snow, pink-cheeked and healthy, while Astrid hung laundry to freeze-dry in the bitter air, a traditional Scandinavian practice. Mr. Vikland, Whitmore began, choosing his words carefully. I need to understand what happened here. Your family appears unaffected. We've had 2 deaths in the district, dozens of cases of exposure-related illness. Yet your children are playing. Gunnar invited them inside. In the main chamber, warmed by a small midday fire, he showed them his fuel consumption records. He'd meticulously tracked every piece of wood burned. Total usage over the 3-day crisis: 42 pieces of split wood, averaging perhaps 8 pounds each. Total, approximately 336 pounds. Brenner, who'd accompanied the officials, had burned nearly 9 times that amount for far worse results. How? Brenner demanded. Just how? The same cold hit all of us. Your stove isn't bigger. Your firebox is smaller than mine. What am I missing? Gunnar walked them through the physics, speaking slowly to ensure the translation of technical concepts. The earth around us is stable at 50 degrees, always. This is the starting point, not minus 40 degrees. So my stove must only add 15 degrees to reach comfort. Your cabin starts at whatever temperature the outside is. Your stove must add 75 degrees or more. Much harder, yes? He showed them the thermal mass system. The serpentine chimney, storing heat in the surrounding stone and clay, the underbed heat storage, the lack of convective air circulation that normally plague conventional structures. Every time wind pushes against cabin wall, he continued, it pulls heat out through wood. The log is conductor. Not very good, but still conducts. Earth is insulator. It does not conduct well, so heat stays inside. Dr. Pruitt examined the children, checking their color, listening to their lungs, assessing their overall health. No signs of illness, he reported. Actually, they appear healthier than most children I've seen this week. The air quality in here is good. I was concerned about stuffiness, but your ventilation system works. Whitmore studied the railroad tie ceiling, the lime-plastered walls, the carefully designed entrance system. His expression shifted from skepticism to something like awe. Mr. Vikland, he said finally, I owe you an apology. We thought you were risking your family's lives through stubborn foolishness. Instead, he paused, searching for words. Instead, you may have built the safest shelter in the territory. The vindication should have felt sweet. But Gunnar, thinking of the Johansson child and old Emil Sorensen, felt only sadness. If others had listened, he said quietly, maybe fewer would have suffered. News spread quickly. By the following week, homesteaders began appearing at the Vikland property, asking questions, taking measurements, studying the design. Martin Kessler, the builder who'd predicted catastrophic failure, spent an entire afternoon examining the structure and taking notes. I was wrong, Kessler admitted bluntly. I calculated earth pressure, but didn't account for the thermal benefits. I focused on what could fail and missed what actually works. He paused, running his hand along the lime-plastered wall. This is brilliant engineering. Simple, but brilliant. The empirical data was undeniable. Temperature performance. Exterior low. -41 degrees Fahrenheit tunnel home, interior low. 54 degrees Fahrenheit conventional cabin average interior. 36 degrees Fahrenheit differential advantage. 18 degrees Fahrenheit, or 50% warmer relative to freezing. Fuel consumption. Tunnel home. 336 pounds would over 72 hours. 4.7 pounds per hour. Conventional cabin average. 2,800 pounds would over 72 hours. 39 pounds per hour. Efficiency advantage. 8.3x less fuel for superior comfort health outcomes. Tunnel home. 0 illness, 0 injury, 0 distress. District average. 28% of population experienced exposure-related illness. The numbers told a story that mockery and skepticism could no longer refute. Ancient wisdom, dismissed as primitive ignorance, had outperformed modern frontier construction by every measurable metric. The earth shelter design hadn't just survived the crisis, it had thrived. And as word spread beyond the immediate district, something remarkable began to happen. People started digging. By late January 1888, the transformation was remarkable. Where once Gunnar Vikland had stood alone with his insane tunnel home, now 7 other families in the district had begun excavating their own earth shelter dwellings. The designs varied. Some built into natural hillsides like Gunnar's. Others created artificial berms of earth piled against conventional cabin walls. And a few ambitious souls attempted fully underground structures with only entrance tunnels visible from the surface. Harold Brenner was among the converts. In early February, he appeared at Gunnar's entrance with a notebook full of sketches and questions. I need to understand the chimney path, Brenner said, his earlier mockery completely absent. The serpentine design. How do you calculate the angle changes? How much thermal mass is optimal? Gunnar spent 3 hours that afternoon teaching Brenner the principles his uncle had taught him in Finnmark. The ratio of firebox size to chimney length, the importance of surrounding stone mass, the physics of convective draw versus radiant heat capture. Brenner took notes like a dedicated student, occasionally shaking his head in wonder. It's so simple, he muttered at one point. How do we not see this? You saw cabins, Gunnar replied. Because cabins are what you knew. Sometimes, old knowledge looks like ignorance until crisis proves it is wisdom. Martin Kessler, whose technical report had nearly gotten the Vikland family evicted, took a different approach to his conversion. He began conducting systematic experiments, building test structures at quarter scale, to measure heat retention, earth pressure, and structural stability under various conditions. His findings, which he presented at a territorial builders conference in Bismarck that spring, became something of a sensation. I have tested conventional frame construction against earth shelter design under controlled conditions, Kessler reported to an audience of frontier builders and territorial officials. The data is unambiguous. Earth-sheltered structures require 73% less fuel to maintain equivalent interior temperatures. They demonstrate superior stability in high winds, zero structural movement versus measurable frame deflection in conventional builds. And they provide passive cooling in summer, reducing interior temperatures by an average of 12 degrees Fahrenheit compared to surface structures. He concluded with words that must have cost him significant professional pride. I dismissed Mr. Weikland's design as primitive and dangerous. I was comprehensively wrong. This represents sophisticated engineering that we would do well to study and adapt. The territorial newspaper, the Bismarck Tribune, ran a feature story in March 1888 titled "The Norwegian's Tunnel. Ancient Wisdom Saves Lives on the Frontier." The article detailed Gunnar's design, the crisis survival statistics, and a growing movement toward earth-sheltered construction. Requests for information poured in from across the territory and beyond. Homesteaders in Montana, Minnesota, even as far as Wyoming wanted to know how to build their own tunnel homes. Gunnar responded to every letter he could, though his English writing remained halting. Astrid, whose English had improved considerably, helped compose detailed responses with sketches and measurements. They never charged for this information. Gunnar considered it a moral obligation to share knowledge that could save lives. By the end of 1888, county records showed that 43 earth-shelter dwellings had been constructed within a 50-mile radius of Edgeley. The designs varied widely. Some were sophisticated interpretations of Gunnar's principles. Others were crude attempts that missed crucial details, but all represented a fundamental shift in frontier building philosophy. The most dramatic validation came during the winter of 1888 to 89, which brought cold nearly as severe as the previous year. Temperatures again plunged to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, sustained for nearly a week. But this time, the death toll was zero. Exposure-related illnesses dropped by an estimated 60% compared to the previous winter. And across the district, families in earth-sheltered homes reported fuel consumption averaging 1/5 that of conventional structures. Dr. Pruitt, conducting a health survey that spring, noted the correlation explicitly. Districts with higher adoption of earth shelter construction demonstrated significantly lower rates of cold-related illness and death. This is not coincidence. This is proven public health benefit from superior engineering. Even Reverend Sibley, who'd condemned the tunnel home as unchristian earth worship, quietly revised his position. His Sunday sermon in April 1889 touched on the theme of wisdom taking many forms. How God's provision included not just trees for building, but earth for insulation, and the intelligence to recognize which tools suited which purpose. We are called to be good stewards, Sibley preached. Sometimes that means building upward toward heaven. Sometimes it means building into the ground God created. Wisdom is recognizing the difference. Astrid, who'd returned to church services, appreciated the reversal even as she recognized its incompleteness. Sibley still didn't quite understand that this wasn't about divine revelation. It was about physics, thermodynamics, and centuries of accumulated knowledge from cultures who'd learned to thrive in harsh climates. But it was progress nonetheless. The Weikland children grew up with a unique perspective on their childhood home. Ingrid, years later, would write in her diary about the warm winters, the games played by lamplight in the earth-sheltered chamber, the sense of safety when blizzards raged above. Henrik would eventually become a civil engineer, specializing in sustainable building design, a career path directly inspired by his father's innovation. Gunnar himself never sought recognition beyond his immediate community. When the territorial governor visited Edgeley in 1890 and specifically asked to tour the famous tunnel home, Gunnar received him politely but without fanfare. He showed the governor the same things he'd shown dozens of other visitors: the serpentine chimney, the thermal mass storage, the ventilation system, the entrance airlock. You've contributed significantly to territorial development, the governor said. Save lives, reduce suffering, advanced building science. The territory owes you gratitude. Gunnar shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. I built a house. Used old methods. Nothing special. But it was special, and not just for its technical excellence. The tunnel home represented something larger. A challenge to the assumption that frontier progress meant abandoning traditional knowledge in favor of modern methods. It proved that indigenous and immigrant wisdom, refined over centuries in harsh climates worldwide, could outperform contemporary American frontier construction. The lesson extended beyond building techniques. It spoke to a fundamental human tendency, the refusal to learn from those perceived as foreign, primitive, or unconventional. How many other solutions to frontier challenges existed in the traditional knowledge of native peoples, Scandinavian immigrants, Chinese laborers, Mexican settlers, solutions that were being ignored or actively suppressed because they didn't fit preconceived notions of proper American methods. Gunnar's tunnel home hadn't just survived a crisis. It had exposed the arrogance inherent in dismissing entire bodies of knowledge without examination. The crazy Norwegian had been right, and the experienced builders had been dangerously wrong. That reversal should have prompted deeper reflection about what other wisdom was being lost or ignored. Some learned that lesson. The Territorial Building Code was revised in 1891 to explicitly permit earth shelter construction, with guidelines based on Gunnar's design principles. Agricultural extension services began teaching thermal mass heating and earth insulation as valid techniques. And slowly, grudgingly, the frontier building culture expanded to incorporate knowledge from beyond its own narrow experience. But many didn't learn. Even as earth-sheltered homes proved their worth, criticism continued from those who viewed them as aesthetically inferior, socially regressive, or simply too different from convention. The tension between innovation and tradition, between indigenous wisdom and imported methods, between what worked and what looked proper, these tensions would persist long after the frontier closed. Gunnar Viklund died in 1924 at the age of 73 in the same tunnel home he'd built 37 years earlier. The structure remained sound, the thermal mass system still functioning exactly as designed. His children inherited the property, and Henrik eventually converted it into a demonstration site for sustainable building techniques, one of the first such educational facilities in the upper Midwest. The tunnel home stands today preserved as a historical landmark. Visitors can descend the entrance tunnel, stand in the main chamber, and feel the same stable temperature that kept the Viklund family alive during the winter of 1887. Educational plaques explain the physics, the cultural context, the social resistance, and the eventual vindication. But perhaps the most important lesson isn't displayed on any plaque. It's implicit in the structure itself. That knowledge dismissed as primitive, methods mocked as insane, and wisdom carried by immigrants and indigenous peoples often contain solutions to problems that modern approaches cannot solve. The challenge is not technical, it's cultural. It's having the humility to recognize that our assumptions about progress might be wrong, and the courage to learn from those we've been taught to dismiss. Gunnar Viklund never claimed to have invented anything. He'd simply remembered what others had forgotten, and had the stubbornness to trust that ancient wisdom over contemporary mockery. In doing so, he didn't just save his family. He reminded an entire frontier district that survival often depends on recognizing that different doesn't mean inferior. Sometimes it means superior, if we're wise enough to notice. The Earth still maintains that stable 50-degree temperature, 6 feet down, regardless of the chaos above. It always has. We just forget to use it, then wonder why we're burning so much wood to stay warm. Before you go, I need your help. If this story of overlooked wisdom and frontier survival resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. I promise to keep bringing you these hidden histories, the practical engineering and traditional knowledge that our ancestors used to survive and thrive. Drop a comment below. What traditional survival techniques do you think we've foolishly abandoned? I read every response, and your insights often inspire the next deep dive. The tunnel home proved that sometimes the old ways aren't outdated. They're just waiting for crisis to reveal their value. Don't wait for crisis to value wisdom. Learn it now, while the learning is easy. Until next time, stay warm, stay curious, and remember, progress isn't always forward. Sometimes it's downward, into the earth that's been keeping secrets about survival for longer than we've been building houses. Educational note. This script presents historical reconstruction based on documented earth-sheltered building practices and frontier settlement patterns. While the specific characters and events are dramatized for narrative purposes, the engineering principles, thermodynamics, and comparative performance data reflect actual physics and historical building techniques. Earth-sheltered construction remains viable today, but should be undertaken with proper engineering consultation and compliance with modern building codes. This presentation is educational and historical, not professional building advice.